The Sandbox Smart R2 roaster looks amazing on paper. It's a 400-gram drum roaster that has an app that gives you a lot more control than you'd expect from most smaller home roasters. It has a lot of potential, but it's not all roasty with the R2. By the end of this video, you'll have some idea of whether this is the home roaster for you. I've been looking for a good medium-scale roaster for a long time, something that can fit in my small Tokyo apartment so I can roast coffee for my friends. I got the Sandbox Smart R1 last year, which is a great little machine for an individual, but you can't roast nearly enough to share it with your friends and family. I thought the R2 would be a great step up. It can roast 200 to 400 grams at a time, and it's not so big that it requires its own room. I reached out to QB Brothers, who distribute this in Japan, and they sent me one to borrow so I can do this review, so thank you so much for that. So let's start with a rundown of the hardware, and I'll tell you how this machine feels like to use on a regular basis like I have for the last month. The R2 is a hefty beast. It weighs in at around 17 kilos and it's all enclosed in one box. It's definitely got more of a home appliance feeling to it than some of the more industrial looking roasters out there. Immediately looking at it, one of the things that I liked the most was the huge front window that lets you check the coffee at any stage of the roast. Most roasters that can do as high a capacity as this usually have a completely enclosed metal case with a little paddle that you use to check the coffee beans. Now there might be a trade-off here with heat escape. A little bit more heat comes off the front panel which you can feel as you're roasting the coffee. But for a home appliance, I think this is a really cool feature and I think they played this right. At the front, there's a tray that pulls out when you're ready to flip open the front window and drop the beans. The latch to open the drum and let the beans out flicks up satisfyingly when you use it, although sometimes it is a little bit difficult to put back in place. You have to line it up just right. There's an on and off switch at the back and a power button at the front. In all honesty, they could and should have removed the power button from the front because it doesn't really have any purpose. You control everything through the app, so it's a bit weird that the app tells you to press this button at the front when the app controls basically everything else. Inside the tray at the front, there's another tray with a Chaff Collector, which does a generally very good job of removing parchment from the beans, and the app reminds you to remove this and get rid of all the chaff so it doesn't become a fire risk. The heating power from the machine comes from an element tube in the middle, with fins all around the drum to rotate the beans so they don't get all toasty on one side. In my experience, the roast has been very even, and it doesn't easily scorch the beans if you have a decently high drum speed. Even at 95 to 100% power, I haven't seen much scorching or tipping, which would look like blackening in the center or at the tips of the beans. The heating element also has enough power to get to first crack a lot more quickly than other home roasters. It's usually been around 8 or 9 minutes that I reach the first crack on a full load, and I've even reached first crack at around 5 minutes and 50 seconds on a 200 gram load. This is super important because a lot of home roasters don't have enough power to reach first crack quickly, and so you generally end up getting there at around 14 or 15 minutes, which means baking the beans, which will end up with a parchment-like, boring, flat flavor. Once the machine has heated up, which is all done in the app, it will tell you that it's time to put the green beans in the machine. You can do that using the flap at the front and the bean tray that comes with the machine. This is definitely better for temperature stability than the original R1, which had you opening the front and putting the drum in the machine, which would let a lot of the heat out, lowering your starting temperatures. I have had a few spills with this narrow entry point, but I'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. The smoke for the machine comes out from a little vent in the side here, and this can kick out a lot of smoke. You definitely need to find a good way to deal with this, like an exhaust fan that I got from a local hardware shop, so that you can get the smoke going out of an extractor fan or out of a window, rather than all into your apartment. Unlike with some smaller roasting machines, you can't just put this under your extractor fan and hope for the best. I used to do this with my R1, but this is just not an option for this machine. Now, I don't want to set off my fire alarm just to get some B-roll footage of this, so here's an artist's rendering of what my kitchen would look like if I roasted on this without an extracting tube. My guess would be that Sandbox is trying to get you to buy their smart F1 smoke reducing device. But since I don't have one of those, I just tape my exhaust tube to the side of the machine and to my extractor fan. It's not the prettiest, but it works. The app will also tell you when it's time to open up the machine and give the inside a clean to get rid of some of those coffee oils. And the box even includes a screwdriver so you can open up the front when necessary. Now, what kind of a man doesn't have a screwdriver in his house? All in all, the hardware is pretty great. It does a good job of roasting, and it's small and easy to put away when not in use. The coffee I've had from the R2 has also mostly been pretty great. After a few really bad roasts at the beginning while I was getting used to the machine, I was able to put together a generalist profile that worked for most of the bean varieties I was putting into it, and was easy to adjust for different varieties of beans. If you want to see my general profile, I'll leave a link to this in the description below, and if you have an R2, you can try it out for yourself. So while I do think the hardware is generally pretty solid, there are a few complaints I have before we get into the software section of this video. There are a few small things I mentioned already, like the latch at the front being a little bit difficult to put back in sometimes, and the pointless power button on the front. But the biggest of these small issues is the chute for putting the green beans in at the beginning of the roast. It's just too narrow, and often the beans will get stuck unless you're really careful about pouring the beans in one layer at a time. And if the green beans do roll out, which they sometimes do, they often get stuck down the side, which makes it impossible to close the chute. In a machine of this price, I might expect to have a small removable chute that slides in nicely to prevent hang-ups like this. The tray at the bottom that you use to drop the beans into when you've finished roasting also has a similar issue. It's a little bit too narrow, so beans often fly randomly out the side. I usually move the tray back and forward to try and prevent this from happening, but almost always with a 400-gram load, I'm usually cleaning up stray beans from the floor afterwards. Oh, there you are. Like many other roasters, I would suggest not going to the full listed load of 400 grams. Roaster machine manufacturers almost always overestimate the maximum carrying capacity of their roasters. And for me, I found that at 400 grams with the R2, it was a little bit difficult to get to a first crack within a decent amount of time, especially for light roasts. With a 200 to 300 gram load, I was able to get to first crack a little bit earlier and have 8 to 10 minute roasts that had good 15 to 25% development time. By the way, if you don't know what I mean by development time or other terms of art used in coffee roasting, I made a whole video about this that you can check out on my channel later. Like I said, a few solvable and put upable with problems aside, is put upable with a word? The hardware is pretty good. Let's talk about the app. The roasting process is done in the app by setting up control points, which tell the roaster what power, fan speed, and drum speed to use at any specific point in the roast. As you're roasting, you'll see a red curve for the temperature of the inside of the drum, and a black curve, which is the ROR, or rate of rise, which tells you how quickly the temperature is increasing. So far, so good. This is great information, and much more than you get on most home roasters. You can use the default profiles that they have in the app. They have versions for a light, medium, or dark roast, and also slow roast versions of each one. But to be honest, these basic profiles are just not good, and they ignore a lot of conventional wisdom about proper roasting technique. I talked about this a little bit in my review of the R1, and I had hoped that the company would update the app and improve this over time, but it's pretty much the same system with the R2. There are some advanced profiles that you can get from competition level roasters if you subscribe to their app, but I can't really see the point in doing this because usually you're not going to be using the same beans that these professional roasters are using. It's just a flawed philosophy because every bean is going to require adjusting based on too many conditions to just have a general Ethiopian Yirgacheffe coffee bean profile. So the general way you'll roast with this machine is set up the whole process in advance and start the machine warming up while you get your beans ready. You can play around with the settings a little bit beforehand, such as adjusting control points or the starting charge temperature, but once you've started the roast, those control points are locked in. You can do a manual roast where you adjust power, fan, and drum speed throughout the roast, but once you turn on manual mode, there's no going back to the control points that you set. I've learned a lot about roasting in the last few years, and I've tried making my own proper profiles in the app, but I've taken to using a spreadsheet to note what I do in my manual roast and then putting it into the app later on, which is really uncomfortable to do. This is just the start of my issues with the app. I'm going to talk about these small things first and work up. First, small UI annoying thing. When you first put the beans in the drum, also known as the charge, the app comes up with a little checkbox you have to press before you press start, and for some reason, it's incredibly small. UI is important, and if you're using an app frequently, little things like this can get on your nerves because there's no reason for it to be this way. Next is that setting up the control points is an unusual and quite complicated way of setting up your roast. You basically have to predict what your roast is going to look like before you even start, which is just not reasonable. You can put the roaster into manual mode and control the power, fan, and drum speed as you like, but there's no way to save these as control points after you've done the roast. You just get a temperature and ROR reading and no indicators of when you manually changed power, fan, or drum speeds throughout the roast. Even worse than this is that when you press the first crack button, it marks the first crack and also changes all of the settings to those that you defined before you started the roast. This almost always results in a hard temperature crash as it lowers the temperature quickly, resulting in flat and papery tasting coffee even if you otherwise had a very good roast. You can adjust this after you've pressed the first crack button, but only up to 75% power maximum, and I think it'd be easy for them to make it so that when you're in manual mode, it just marks the first crack, rather than changing your settings so that you have to rush to avoid getting a temperature crash. Because of this, I've started marking the first crack on a piece of paper and mentally calculating development time as I go instead of using the first crack button. It would be so much better if pressing the first crack button just marked the first crack, and instead of starting a countdown timer to when the beans would drop, it started a development time percentage count up timer, which I think most roasters would agree is much more useful. There's also a massive missed opportunity with manual roasting. Wouldn't it be amazing if you could manually roast a coffee and then it would save that manual roast as a series of control points so you could roast the same coffee in the exact same way again, or make small adjustments to the roast curve. This would be incredibly useful as you wouldn't have to pay such close attention to a coffee that you've already created a decent profile for, and can save yourself a lot of time and get more consistent results. I mentioned this as a possible future feature to Sandbox, and I'll let you know in the pinned comment below if they implement this in the future. The app also has a mandatory cooling cycle that you can't cancel until the internal temperature reaches 120 degrees C. Sandbox told me that this is to protect the components from heat damage, which I totally understand, but this makes it incredibly difficult to make a batch-to-batch temperature protocol, which you'll need if you're doing consistent roasts on a regular basis. This is going to make the temperatures less consistent, so if you're roasting a lot, you will notice differences in your roast profiles from batch to batch. And for that reason, I wouldn't recommend this machine for someone who's trying to roast as a side business. So the Sandbox Smart R2 has me asking a lot of questions, like, what is the meaning of life? And who is this roaster supposed to be for? Now, the meaning of life question I can answer. It's all about finding and making the most amazing coffee you can. But that second question is a little bit harder. Sandbox told me that this machine is made for families or small groups of coffee drinkers who might be using 50 to 100 grams per day for a few cups of coffee each. And I can certainly see that in terms of the batch size. With its focus on prefab or default profiles for each kind of bean, rather than making it easy to work with manual roasts, I would suggest that this machine is probably for people who don't want to learn everything there is to know about the roasting process. But would people roasting for family and friends really go out and spend $2,500 or more on a coffee roaster if they're not really that interested in learning about roasting? This is what really confuses me about this machine, and I'm not really sure who to recommend this for. If you're just making coffee for yourself at home, the R1 is a very capable machine and about a third of the price of this one, and I've enjoyed using my R1 at home despite the same issues with the app. But if you're interested to roast bigger batches, I feel like anyone who'd be interested in a machine like this would be better served by a small commercial scale roaster or something like the Ileo Bullet. But I really want to know what you think about this. Am I being too harsh on the Sandbox Smart R2? What other machines are there on the market for a home roaster who wants more control? Is this a machine that you've had your eye on, and could I be missing something? Let me know all your thoughts about this machine and home roasting in the comments below. Now, if this video was useful for you, please give it a like, as this helps appease the YouTube algorithm gods and helps me make more videos like this. And thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, you wonderfully overcaffeinated people. May all of your espressos be god shots, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here again for the next video.